When we enter the Middle Ages, we may be surprised by how primitive and difficult toilet habits were. This is despite toilets being one of the most basic necessities of modern life. There was no running water, portable nighttime cabins were used, feces were left out in the open, and there were those sharp, unbearable odours. None of the comfort and hygiene we associate with toilets today existed. So how did people meet their toilet needs at night? In cold stone castles, waste fell through small toilet holes, and filth accumulated in the narrow streets of cities. All these details directly affected the quality of life for people in the Middle Ages. Moreover, the smell was not just a nuisance, but an ever-present part of life. In this video, we will explore the lesser-known aspects of toilet culture in the Middle Ages, the secrets of night cabinets, and how people adapted to living without running water and foul odours. Are you ready to embark on a quiet journey into the darkest and smelliest corners of the past? Starting the day with the toilet. Where, how, and when. In the Middle Ages, mornings were very different from how they are in the modern world. There was no smell of coffee or phone alarms to wake people up. Starting the day was more about repeating survival habits than following a routine. At the beginning of these repetitive actions came a moment often spent in silence, with a sense of embarrassment, the morning toilet routine. The concept of the toilet as we understand it today had not yet emerged. Even the words used in many languages to describe this action lacked subtlety, reflecting the conditions of the time. The French word toilette, which originally meant morning preparations, and the English word privy, meaning a hidden place, clearly reveal what was being hidden. Relieving oneself was a topic not discussed in public. Yet it was an inescapable necessity that everyone had to perform every morning. So where would a medieval person go upon waking up? Was there a toilet inside the house? What would they do if they lived in a village? And how would this differ if they lived in a city? The answers to these questions varied depending on social class, geographical location, and even the time of year. For most people, however, the answer was quite simple: an outdoor pit or an indoor chamber. In the Middle Ages, people generally woke up at sunrise. This was because artificial lighting was virtually non-existent. Although it was possible to spend the night in a house with just a single candle or lantern, the morning light definitively signalled the start of a new day. The first person to wake up would often sit up in bed and listen to their surroundings. The silence would be broken by the sound of a rooster in the village, or a horse-drawn cart passing by in the city streets. At that moment, the body's natural rhythm would also kick in. But there was no such thing as a bathroom. Neither the bathroom nor the toilet were usually inside the house. The morning toilet routine was a responsibility in itself. It required both privacy and a floor. If the household was large, and most homes had at least 5 or 6 people living in them, one might even have to wait in line to attend to one's morning needs. In such cases, there was an object that everyone turned to: the night pot. These ceramic containers were usually placed under the bed or by the bedside. Used throughout the night or upon waking in the morning, they were emptied outside as dawn broke. Sometimes under a tree in the garden, sometimes at the corner of the street, and sometimes in a pit behind the house. There was usually nothing used to mask the odour. Therefore, the morning hours, especially in summer, were accompanied by a strong smell. Very few houses had a separate toilet room. Some wealthy families had special cabins carved into stone walls. These cabins either opened to the outside or were connected to a septic tank built under the house. However, if these septic tanks were not cleaned regularly, they would eventually overflow and spread foul odours throughout the house. So, living in luxury actually meant being exposed to greater discomfort. For villagers, things were simpler or more primitive. Typically, a pit was dug near the house and surrounded by stones. 2 stones were placed on top to create a seating area, which was then covered with a tent or piece of cloth. These outdoor toilets were used in turn each morning, after which the area was covered with soil. In winter, doing this on frozen ground was more difficult. Going outside in the cold took courage. Therefore, the first task of the day was to use the wooden bucket placed beside the door instead. In some regions, especially in castles where nobles lived, special structures called wall-mounted channels could be found. These were small, open-bottomed holes sloping outwards. People used the toilet through these holes, and the excrement was poured directly outside the castle walls. The ground below was either empty land or a ditch through which rainwater flowed. Although this system resembled an engineering product, it caused unbearable smells around the castle during the rainy season. Timing was usually based on instinct. This need was usually taken care of in the morning before going out to work in the fields or before feeding the animals. Being outside during the day meant that it was not possible to find a toilet. The situation was slightly different for those living in cities. In large cities such as Paris, there were communal pits in some squares. These pits were usually hidden inside a wooden frame, and people would take turns to use them in the morning. However, these crowded, unsanitary areas were also a source of epidemics. These toilets played a significant role in the spread of major epidemics, such as the plague. Medieval people did not hide their need to use the toilet, but they did not talk about it either. This subject was shrouded in silence. For women in particular, morning toilet duties were more private and secretive. If there were more than one woman in the house, the morning routine also involved waiting patiently for each other. The task of emptying the vase was usually left to the youngest member of the household. Children grew up performing such tasks, while the elderly often needed assistance with theirs. Modern conveniences such as flushing toilets, washing hands with soap, and using deodorizing sprays were unknown in the Middle Ages. Water was often collected from rainwater or brought from a distant well. Therefore, it was not a regular habit to wash one's hands after using the toilet in the morning. Sometimes wiping with a cloth, and sometimes not cleaning at all was considered normal. It was the norm at the time to get up in the morning and go straight to work without washing one's hands and face after using the toilet. Life was measured more by resilience than hygiene. In the Middle Ages, starting the day with a visit to the bathroom was not the quick, clean and private experience it is today. It was often a smelly, crowded and embarrassing ritual. But it had to be done every day. Each repetition served as a reminder of the reality of the time. Life was far removed from today's comforts. This silent yet inevitable need, which began with sunrise each morning, was the true daily struggle of the medieval person. Perhaps that is why even thinking about it today brings on sleep, because anything mandatory becomes tedious when repeated. Tedious things pave the way to sleep. Night cabins. The hidden corner of the bedroom. In the Middle Ages, bedrooms were not places of rest or intimate spaces in the modern sense. Often shared by several people, they were dimly lit by a single fire or candle, and surrounded by cold stone walls. Sleeping there was a necessity, while comfort was a luxury. However, something else quietly made its way into bedrooms every night: the chamber pot. It was also known as the night vase or relief pot. In other words, a portable toilet. While there may be a toilet in every corner of the house in today's world, this was not possible in the Middle Ages. Going outside in the dark was not only inconvenient, but also often dangerous. it wasn't just the weather. It was also the people and animals one might encounter outside that made the night frightening. Therefore, people developed a practical method of meeting their toilet needs without getting out of bed at night, placing a container under the bed. Put simply, it was a container made of ceramic or metal. It was usually round. The mouth was wide to make it easier to aim in the dark. Some had a small handle, while others only had a rim. Most of these containers were poorly made. After all, functionality was more important than aesthetics. The containers of the wealthy were more ornate and were sometimes silver-plated. However, earthenware or tin was sufficient for the common people. The container would remain beside the bed throughout the night. Sometimes a wooden stand was made for it, or it was placed inside an empty box. In the morning, if the container was full, it would be taken outside and emptied. This emptying process was sometimes done from the windowsill. For those living in narrow street houses in the city, the container, which had filled up overnight, would be emptied into the street by leaning out of the window. This was an unpleasant surprise for anyone passing by in the morning. All members of the household could use the container. However, it was more commonly used by women, elderly people and children. It was dangerous and inappropriate for women to go out at night. Additionally, medieval clothing consisted of layers of skirts and tight garments such as corsets, so it was difficult and time-consuming to leave the house in the middle of the night to relieve oneself outside. Therefore, chamber pots were one of the most practical solutions for women. Pots were also lifesavers for children. One of these pots was always kept by the bedside of children under the age of 5 to prevent them from wetting the bed at night. Over time, the child would learn to use the pot, and emptying it in the morning would become one of their first household chores. Nighttime containers were almost mandatory for the elderly and sick. If there was an elderly person in the house, a container would always be kept nearby. For those who were unable to reach the bathroom or walk, these containers could be used during the day as well as at night. Though they were hygienically problematic, they were an unavoidable functional solution. Cleanliness was understood quite differently in the past compared to today. Pots were emptied every morning, but not necessarily washed. They were usually rinsed with a couple of scoops of water before being put back in place. Some families had made it a habit to wash these pots with soap once a week. However, soap was expensive and water was scarce. Therefore, rinsing with water alone was often considered sufficient. The containers were usually cleaned by the women or young children in the household. Although this task may seem minor, especially in large families, emptying and cleaning 2 to 3 containers every morning required patience and endurance. One of the biggest problems was the smell. Overnight, especially in hot weather, the containers emitted an unbearable odour. If the windows were closed, the smell permeated every corner of the house. For this reason, in some homes, the containers' mouths were covered with cloth or wooden lids. However, this did not completely eliminate the smell. It took time to get used to the smell. People eventually learned to tolerate it. Sometimes lavender sachets were hung in the room, or certain herbs were used to mask the odour. But generally these scents mixed together, and the result was the same. The room smelt strongly of human life and digestive waste. The use of night pots also revealed the gendered nature of society. While men could go outside to the garden at night to relieve themselves, women could not. Women were subject to greater restrictions on privacy than men. The existence of these pots also highlights how limited women's living spaces were. Therefore, while the night pot provided some degree of comfort, it also created dependency. Women found it difficult to spend the night without them, and they were responsible for cleaning them. Thus, the practicality of their use was offset by the burden of responsibility. Night pots were not just tools for meeting a basic need, they were also guardians of silence and sleep patterns. In the Middle Ages, nighttime silence was sacred. Household members spoke in low voices and avoided making noise so as not to disturb one another. In this silence, someone leaving the house in the middle of the night could disrupt others' sleep. This is why the pots were used. They were then quietly pushed under the bed and left there until morning. Night pots were an indispensable yet small part of medieval home life. Although these portable toilets would be unthinkable today, they were a necessity and a source of comfort for people in that era. Thanks to them, nights became safer, more comfortable, and more bearable. However, every morning the container had to be taken outside and emptied. This small, hidden corner of the house was confronted with the harsh reality of the outside world every morning, and this cycle repeated itself every night, just like sleep itself, silent, repetitive, and slow. Castle toilets, cold holes in the castle. When we think of the Middle Ages, castles are undoubtedly one of the first structures that come to mind. Surrounded by stone walls and towering high into the sky, these imposing structures symbolized grandeur and power. However, life inside these imposing stone structures, which appear so impressive from the outside, would have been rather difficult and uncomfortable by modern standards. Life in a castle was marked by constant threat, with days spent confined within the walls. Cold, dampness, drafts, and inadequate lighting were commonplace. Yet amidst all these hardships, the systems developed for one of the most basic needs were remarkably primitive yet functional: the toilets. These were typically small niches built into the outer walls of the castle and surrounded by cold stone. These structures are rarely mentioned in history books. After all, no one talks at length about castle toilets. But like every human being, every nobleman had to relieve himself somehow. This is where these small, dark stone cubicles known as garderobes came into play. The toilet systems used in medieval castles were called garderobes. Although the word has changed in meaning over time, it originally referred to a dressing room or small cabin. In castle architecture, however, the primary function of these cabins was to remove excrement from the castle. A garderobe was a small niche in the castle's main wall. This niche usually contained a seating area made from a single stone block. In the centre of the stone was a round or oval hole. The bottom of the hole was open and faced the outer surface of the castle. Therefore, when waste was disposed of through this hole, it fell outside the castle, often into the open air. There was no septic tank or channel to collect it. It was hoped that it would be washed away by rain. These small rooms were located in high places, accessible from within the castle, and often reached by spiral staircases. This height made it easier for waste to fall downwards. However, it also created a significant draft. Sitting on the stone seat in winter was almost torture. Castle toilets were not comfortable places. They were narrow, damp, dark and silent. The echo of footsteps between the cold stone walls made these chambers, which were often used alone, even more unsettling. One would enter with a lamp or candle, but the wind could easily extinguish the light. This was because the garderobe was usually located on the north facade, which was exposed to the wind. Many people avoided using these toilets at night. Due to fear, the cold and the risk of falling, other solutions were sought. For example, portable night pots. However, during the day, especially after long feasts or meetings, Using these toilets was inevitable. One of the most distinctive features of castle toilets was the constant airflow inside them, which was due to their open design. This helped reduce the odour problem to some extent. However, the same airflow froze the interior in winter and attracted flies and insects from outside in summer. In some castles, a small soap dish or a bag of herbs was hung on the wall of the guardrobe chamber. These herbs were used to mask odours. However, as soap and odour masking agents were expensive, most castle residents had to rely solely on their reflexes to adapt. Over time, their sense of smell dulled, and they became accustomed to these areas. There was no regular cleaning system for waste that fell under the toilet. In some castles, waste was dumped over the walls, which made these areas filthy over time. Birds, mice, and insects made their homes in these areas, and the air around the castle became heavy. Cleaning was left at the mercy of the rain. It was hoped that heavy rainfall would wash away the waste. In some castles, these holes were connected to ditch systems and the waste was directed into water channels. However, such systems were rare, generally only found in large, wealthy castles. These toilets were not just for the nobility. Everyone living in the castle, including guards, servants and cooks, had to use them. However, not everyone had access to them. Some toilets were connected to private rooms and could only be used by the person staying in that room. This was a sign of privilege. Servants had separate toilets, usually located on lower floors. These toilets were narrower, more humid and less well maintained. Thus, even the toilets had become a symbol of social class distinctions. Toilet rooms were generally quiet, unspoken passageways. In castle life, everything moved slowly anyway. Meals were cooked slowly, news spread slowly, and conversations were measured. Against this backdrop of slowness, toilet use was also quiet and ordinary. When someone went to the bathroom, the reason was usually unclear to others. Everyone knew, but no one mentioned it. When they returned, nobody asked, "Where were you?" This need was a shared reality that everyone silently accepted. Castle bathrooms were overlooked, yet frequently used spaces in the Middle Ages. Behind ornate walls and in the shadow of grand feasts, people sought to fulfill their most basic human needs in quiet, cold stone chambers. Sometimes they sat facing the wind. Sometimes they found their way in the dark by candlelight. The garderobes were neither aesthetically pleasing nor comfortable, but they were functional. This function was repeated every day, just like castle life itself. Cold, heavy, rhythmic, and silent. Odour, an explanation based on necessity, not science. Odour is a phenomenon that is present throughout life, yet often goes unnoticed. Modern humans can largely control their perception of it through advanced hygiene practices and technological solutions. However, for medieval humans, odour was an inescapable and constant reality. Moreover, adaptation was often necessary rather than seeking a solution to the odour. This adaptation was not a simple adjustment, but a form of acceptance imposed by necessity. In the conditions of that era, there were no medicines or technologies to combat bad odours. Products such as perfume and deodorant were only available to the elite. Ordinary people had to get used to odours because they had no other choice. There were many different sources of bad odours in the Middle Ages. The most prominent were feces and urine. These waste products were often left exposed and washed away by rain. Animal manure. In villages, animals were kept inside or just outside the house. Horse, cow, and sheep manure was spread around the area. Rotting food, fruit, vegetables, and meat spoiled easily, especially in summer. Dirty water and mud. The streets were often covered in mud and dirty water, and the smell became even more pronounced after rain. The human body, hygiene was poor and bathing was rare, so sweat and body odour were commonplace. This combination resulted in a constant intense smell in medieval streets and homes. At that time, perfumes were only accessible to court officials and the very wealthy. Plants that could mask odours, such as lavender, rosemary and bay leaves, were known to the general population but were not widely used. This was because they were difficult to obtain and expensive. Some people tried to reduce unpleasant smells by placing such herbs on their clothes or in their hair or homes. Those who bathed in public baths were cleaner and less smelly, if only temporarily. However, these efforts were insufficient to change the overall situation. Over time, the human brain filters out odours to which it is constantly exposed. This also applies to unpleasant odours. People in the Middle Ages gradually lost their sensitivity to the foul odours they encountered daily. This process was unconscious. Nobody said, "I'm ignoring the smell." Rather, their noses simply became accustomed to the odours over time. This adaptation was akin to a psychological defence mechanism. Bad odours were accepted as an inevitable reality and mentally ignored. At the same time, drawing attention to odours in society was considered rude. Saying, "You smell bad," was perceived as a direct insult. This also contributed to covering up odours. Members of society and royalty smelt better due to their use of perfume and frequent bathing. Therefore, cleanliness became a status symbol. Common people, on the other hand, had to accept their own odour rather than trying to hide it. This distinction was also evident in how smell was perceived. The lower classes were more tolerant of bad smells, while good smells were a sign of wealth and power. Odour acted as an invisible barrier between social classes. During certain periods, epidemics led to bad odours being perceived as even more negative. During the Black Death, for example, bad smells were considered harbingers of disease, and everyone tried to suppress them. However, there was no truly effective method of odour control. Aromatic herbs and incense were used, but these only provided temporary relief. In crowded, unsanitary cities in particular, it was impossible to completely eliminate bad odours. Medieval people learned not to fight bad smells, but to accept them as part of life. Smell was an inevitable and constant part of life. Over time, their noses and minds got used to it, and social norms reinforced this situation. What is now considered challenging and unpleasant was a common, everyday reality in the Middle Ages. This reality was quietly accepted and gradually became part of everyday life. Odour was the silent, invisible burden of the Middle Ages. Although it was not meant to be noticed, it was always there. Perhaps that is why life in that era was much harder than it is today. There was no such thing as toilet paper. Alternatives were painful. Toilet paper is an indispensable part of modern bathroom habits. This soft, hygienic and user-friendly product is one of the simplest yet most important comfort items of our time. However, toilet paper did not exist in the Middle Ages. In fact, the idea of such a product was unimaginable to people of that time. The use of toilet paper is a consequence of modern technology and industry. Moreover, using it is not only about cleanliness, but also a sign of comfort and hygiene. In the Middle Ages, however, the alternatives for achieving cleanliness were so harsh, uncomfortable or ineffective that they were painful. Therefore, toilet habits were more challenging for people of that era compared to modern humans. In the Middle Ages, the following materials were used for cleaning after defecation and urination. Leaves. In spring and summer, wide, soft leaves found in the environment were preferred. However, these leaves were often hard, thorny or dirty. Straw and grass clippings. In villages where livestock farming was common, straw grass clippings were used. However, these materials were often hard and irritating. Cloth pieces. In some wealthy families, clean cloth scraps or pieces of cloth were preferred. These cloths were washed and saved for reuse. However, cloth was not always readily available. Self-cleaning, hands. Hands were often the last resort. Hands used for cleaning were usually washed with water only, rather than with soap and water. Soap was considered a rare luxury. Stone and clay products. There are records of small stone pieces or clay objects being used for cleaning purposes in some regions. However, these were not widely used and were not very practical. These alternatives fell far below today's standards in terms of softness and hygiene. Leaves and straw, in particular, were often hard and rough, which could cause irritation, pain, and infection. This was particularly challenging for individuals with sensitive skin. Additionally, cleanliness was a serious issue with regard to the materials used for hygiene. Leaves and straw were often found outdoors, where they could become contaminated with dust and animal waste. Even if cloth pieces were used, they were rarely washed regularly. This exacerbated hygiene issues and created conditions conducive to the spread of disease. Understanding of hygiene in the Middle Ages was very different from today's understanding. While personal hygiene was important within the social structure of society, it was not understood in the modern sense. Post-toilet hygiene was often just a habit that affected appearance and comfort. There was no awareness of disease prevention or sterilization. Therefore, the alternatives used were mostly adequate. People prioritized durability and practicality. They used whatever materials were available, often disregarding discomfort. The types of cleaning materials used varied by region and season. In the north, where dry leaves and straw were scarce during the winter months, there were fewer options available, whereas the south offered a greater variety. Cultural customs also influenced cleaning methods. In some societies, for example, the practice of cleaning with the hands persisted for a long time. This practice was supported by social norms and religious rituals. For instance, washing and keeping one's hands clean was considered an integral part of bodily hygiene. Today, it is difficult to imagine life without toilet paper. However, people in the Middle Ages lived with this habit for thousands of years. This habit left a distinct mark on their body and minds. Harsh, painful cleaning methods often required patience and endurance. This highlights just how difficult and uncomfortable daily life was in the Middle Ages. Perhaps that is why modern conveniences are among the most eagerly anticipated things before bedtime. Public toilets in the city. Secret, dark, dangerous. Life in the narrow streets of medieval cities was very different from the order and comfort people are used to today. Most people lived in stone and earth houses, which were often crowded and stuffy, and the streets were busy and chaotic most of the time. Amidst this chaos, the basic need for a toilet posed a significant challenge. As most houses did not have toilets, this need had to be met in public toilets, commonly known as latrines. In medieval cities, these were typically located in secluded, less busy corners of the city. From the street, they often appeared as small, tightly closed stone buildings with no light inside. There were often no signs either. People relied on local knowledge or word-of-mouth information to find them. These toilets were quite simple in structure. They usually consisted of a few narrow wooden or stone cabins with large pits beneath them, into which feces and urine accumulated. Sometimes these pits were left untouched, and sometimes they were connected to the city's sewage system or open channels. Most of the time these systems were clogged, dirty and smelly. Public toilets were quite dangerous in terms of hygiene. These areas were often dark and damp, and had become infested with rats and insects. Poor ventilation meant that unpleasant odours intensified, exposing users to an unbearable stench. Using these toilets at night was even riskier. There was a risk of slipping and falling in the dark. These places could also serve as hiding spots for thieves, bandits, and criminals. For women, using these facilities was often nearly impossible due to security concerns. Public toilets also highlighted the class differences in society. While the wealthy had private toilets and bathrooms, the poor and middle classes had no choice but to use public toilets. Consequently, public toilets became a symbol of the lower class, both physically and socially. The difficulties and dangers associated with using public toilets led people to try to hide the fact that they needed to use them. Secret messages on signs in streets and homes were intended for those who needed to use the toilet, but this need was generally not discussed. Municipalities or city administrations generally did not maintain public toilets. Consequently, toilets often became breeding grounds for filth and disease. During epidemics, these toilets played a significant role in spreading diseases. Although some priests or philanthropists occasionally attempted to keep the toilets clean, cleanliness remained a serious issue overall. In medieval cities, public toilets were a necessary but often avoided part of daily life. Their hidden, dark and dangerous structures posed physical and social challenges for users. However, despite being places that everyone needed, they were indispensable for the city's functionality. These dark corners revealed the true living conditions and hygiene standards of medieval people in their rawest form. For this reason, even discussing them was often avoided. The absence of modern sanitation, cleaning with rainwater, living with odours. In the homes, castles and cities of the Middle Ages, there were no modern sanitation systems. This made it difficult to dispose of waste, which is one of the most basic necessities of life. The idea of toilets, sewers and pipes that could easily be cleaned with running water was completely unimaginable at that time. People tried to overcome this deficiency with practical, albeit often temporary solutions tailored to their circumstances. In the Middle Ages, toilets in homes were either non-existent or very basic. Waste was often disposed of directly outside the home, in ditches or on the street. Sewers were virtually non-existent, being a luxury found only in large cities and wealthy neighbourhoods. This resulted in homes and streets becoming filled with strong odours and filth. The ditches where waste accumulated became breeding grounds for fleas, flies and rats. The foul odours were a constant nuisance and health threat. Rain was one of the greatest allies of medieval people. Rainwater washed the streets and carried away waste, providing a kind of natural cleaning. However, this cleaning was irregular and only temporary. After every rainfall, the streets appeared clean for a brief moment, only to become covered in dirt and mud again shortly afterwards. Rain's role was not limited to cleaning the streets. Rainwater flowing from the gutters of houses also washed away waste that had been thrown outside. However, this system was unplanned and vulnerable. During the winter months, when rainfall decreased and the streets froze, the intensity of odours and dirt increased. Bad smells were an integral part of life in the Middle Ages. Hygiene practices were not as advanced as they are today, so it was impossible to eliminate unpleasant odours completely. People developed a conscious acceptance of this situation and adapted to it. They accepted odour as a fact of life and adapted to it mentally. By reducing their sensitivity to strong smells, people learned to live with them. Thus, bad smells became an inevitable part of life, and social and individual life was organised around this fact. Medieval people tried many temporary methods because they did not have modern plumbing. Windows were kept open to ventilate homes, and aromatic plants, such as lavender and bay leaves, were used to mask odours. In some cities, partial systems were established to remove waste through rainwater channels and ditches. However, none of these methods could solve the fundamental problem. When waste and filth accumulated, unpleasant odours were inevitable. Nevertheless, these solutions demonstrate the ability of medieval people to survive under difficult conditions. In the absence of modern sanitation systems, medieval people relied on the natural cleansing effect of rain and became desensitized to unpleasant odours. This formed the basis of the era's understanding of hygiene. Cleanliness was largely left to natural events, and odours were managed through social acceptance. These issues are easily resolved today thanks to modern water and sewage systems, but they were a constant, unavoidable reality for people at that time. Perhaps for this reason, life in past cities was much heavier and more challenging than it is today. In the Middle Ages, toilets were not only a necessity, but also a tangible symbol of life's hardships and helplessness. Nighttime cabins, cold stone castle chambers, and public city latrines remind us how different people's concepts of comfort and hygiene were. People had to get used to the smell because they had no other choice. They had to cope with the difficulties caused by a lack of running water and limited cleaning supplies, not to mention living in constant filth. This reality highlights once again how challenging life in the Middle Ages was, and how valuable modern comforts are today. If you're interested in these dark yet true aspects of history, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll continue to explore the silent, hidden, and sometimes unsettling stories of the past. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.